You could hear it before you saw it. The slap of masa between your grandmother's palms, the pop and hiss of lard in a cast iron skillet, and the low gurgle of beans that had been simmering since the night before. That kitchen fed a whole family on what most people today would spend on a single cup of coffee. Not because anything was missing, because the women who ran it knew exactly what they were doing. One of these breakfasts was cooked on a repurposed plow disc over an open fire, and you could smell it from 3 houses away. Another turns yesterday's bread and a cone of raw cane sugar into the only sweet thing some families ate during Lent. And the last one on this list needs nothing but 3 colors, a hot skillet, and the steady hand your grandmother never had to think about. So hit subscribe, because these are the breakfasts worth remembering. Here are 25 lost Mexican-American breakfasts only your grandparents knew. Number 25. Atole de masa. Before the sun came up, your grandmother was already standing at the stove stirring a pot of thick, warm corn drink that smelled like the fields after rain. Atole de masa was not the powdered version sold in packets today. It started with fresh masa, dissolved slowly into water or milk, sweetened with piloncillo and scented with a stick of cinnamon. She stirred it constantly with a wooden spoon because the moment you stopped, it clumped. The texture was somewhere between a porridge and a hot drink, thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, but thin enough to sip from a clay mug. Children drank it with a piece of pan dulce on the side, and field workers carried it in jars because it held the warmth longer than coffee. When instant atole mixes replaced the real thing, the patience that the dish required went with it. Making it right took a full half-hour of standing and stirring. And that is exactly the kind of time that modern mornings no longer have. Number 24. Huevos con quelites. Your grandmother walked out to the yard or the edge of a field and came back with a handful of wild greens. Quelites, lamb's quarters, purslane, amaranth leaves, whatever was growing. She rinsed them, chopped them, and scrambled them with eggs, a little onion, and maybe a serrano chile. It cost nothing. It was packed with iron and nutrients that no one measured or talked about, because nobody needed a nutrition label to know it was good food. The knowledge was in knowing which plants to pick and which to leave alone. When families moved to cities and yards turned into concrete, that knowledge went with a generation that held it. Most grandchildren today would walk right past quelites without recognizing them. Number 23. Requesón con piloncillo. When a family made its own queso fresco, there was always leftover whey. And from that whey came requesón, a soft, fresh curd cheese with a mild tang. Drizzled with melted piloncillo or honey, it became a simple sweet breakfast that children loved. Nothing went to waste. The whey that would have been thrown out turned into tomorrow morning's meal. The flavor was gentle, barely sweet, with that faint sourness that only fresh curd has. When families stopped making cheese at home and started buying it wrapped in plastic from a store, Requesón disappeared from the breakfast table almost overnight. Most people under 50 have never tasted it the way it was meant to be eaten, still warm and barely set, straight from the cloth where it drained. Number 22. Caldillo. In northern Mexico and across the border in El Paso and southern New Mexico, breakfast often started with a bowl of thin, clear broth. Caldillo was made from a few strips of dried beef, roasted green chilies, garlic, and a little cumin, simmered in water until the kitchen smelled like smoke and earth. It came to the table in a clay bowl with a stack of flour tortillas on the side. You tore the tortilla, dipped it in the broth, and that was your morning. It warmed you from the inside on cold desert mornings before a long day of work. A few diners in El Paso and Las Cruces still serve a version of it, but the homemade caldillo made from beef your family dried in the backyard is nearly gone. Number 21. Gorditas de cuajada. In the ranch lands of Jalisco and Michoacán, And in the Mexican-American families that came from there, gorditas were not just any corn cake. These were thick rounds of fresh masa, patted by hand, cooked slowly on a dry comal until a golden crust formed on the outside, while the inside stayed soft and warm. Then they were split open and stuffed with cuajada, a fresh curd cheese that had to be made that same morning. The cheese was still warm when it went inside the gordita. The combination of toasted corn and soft, salty curd was a breakfast that could carry a farmer through a full morning of work. When small dairies closed and cuajada became impossible to find in American grocery stores, these gorditas went with them. The masa is easy enough. The curd is what nobody can get anymore. Number 20. Huevos con longaniza. Not chorizo, longaniza. The difference mattered. Longaniza was thinner, drier, and carried a sharper hit of vinegar and paprika that cut through the richness of scrambled eggs in a way chorizo never did. Your grandmother bought it from a carniceria that made it in the back room, hanging the links from metal hooks to cure in the open air. She sliced the casing open, crumbled the meat into a hot skillet, and let it crisp before adding beaten eggs. The fat that rendered out of the sausage was the only cooking oil she needed. Served with a stack of flour tortillas and a roasted serrano on the side, it was a breakfast that could carry you from dawn until sundown. When the small butcher shops closed and factory-packaged chorizo took over the meat aisle, longaniza became something you had to go looking for instead of something that was always there. Number 19. Huevos con chile pasado. In the high desert of Chihuahua and across the border in West Texas, green chilies were roasted over open flame, then hung on long strings in the dry wind until they shriveled dark and leathery. That was chile pasado, and it carried a concentrated, smoky sweetness that fresh chilies could never match. To make breakfast, your grandmother soaked a handful in warm water until they softened, tore them into strips, and scrambled them with eggs in a hot skillet with a little onion. The rehydrated chile turned silky against the eggs, and the soaking liquid went into the pan too, giving everything a depth that came from weeks of desert sun locked into each wrinkled strip. Families in the border towns dried enough chilies in summer to last through winter, and chile pasado con huevo was the breakfast that made the cold months bearable. When supermarkets started selling canned green chilies year-round, the slow work of drying them in the open air lost its hold on the next generation. Number 18. Camote con leche. Purple or orange, it did not matter. A sweet potato went into a pot of warm milk with a stick of cinnamon and a chunk of piloncillo. It simmered low until the camote was soft enough to mash with a spoon right in the bowl. This was the breakfast grandmothers made for small children. Gentle, warm, naturally sweet, without any refined sugar. It filled a child's belly and kept them quiet through the morning. When sugary boxed cereals showed up in every grocery aisle with cartoon characters on the front, camote con leche could not compete for a child's attention. Most kids born after the 1980s never tasted it. They reached for the cereal box instead, and the pot of warm milk stayed on the stove untouched. Number 17. Chileatole. A thick steaming bowl that sat somewhere between soup and porridge. Chileatole started with fresh corn kernels cut straight off the cob, ground or blended into a rough paste, then stirred into a pot of broth with roasted poblano or serrano chilies, epazote, and a pinch of salt. As it simmered, the cornstarch thickened the liquid into something heavy enough to coat a wooden spoon. In the families from Puebla and Tlaxcala who settled in Chicago and Los Angeles, chileatole was the breakfast that warmed the body on mornings when bread and eggs were not enough. The heat from the chile built slowly, and the corn gave it a sweetness that balanced the burn. Some families dropped in small squares of queso fresco that softened in the warmth but never fully melted. When fresh corn became something people bought frozen or canned instead of carrying from the milpa, Chileatole lost the ingredient that made it worth the effort. Number 16. Huevos con chicharrón prensado. Not the puffy, airy chicharrones sold in bags at the gas station. Chicharrón prensado was the leftover pork cracklings compressed into a dense, dark block that your grandmother bought from the carniceria, wrapped in brown paper. She crumbled chunks of it into a hot skillet, where it softened and released its fat, then poured beaten eggs over the top and scrambled everything together. The chicharrón gave the eggs a chewy, porky depth that no other ingredient could match. Some families added a spoonful of salsa verde or a handful of diced tomato to cut through the richness. Others kept it plain, letting the salt and weight of the pressed pork do all the work. Wrapped in a warm flour tortilla, it was a breakfast that sat heavy in the hand and kept you full through a long morning of labor. When the small neighborhood butcher shops gave way to chain grocery stores, chicharrón prensado became something you had to search for instead of something that was always waiting behind the counter. Number 15. Tortas de huevo en Caldillo. Eggs beaten with a fork, sometimes mixed with a little flour, spooned into hot oil, and fried into small golden patties the size of a palm. By themselves, the patties were plain. What made them breakfast was the Caldillo, a thin sauce of roasted tomato, garlic, and dried guajillo chile, simmered until the kitchen filled with smoke. The fried egg patties went into the sauce and soaked there, softening at the edges while the centers stayed firm. In Zacatecas and Durango, and in the families that carried those traditions to Denver and Kansas City, tortas de huevo appeared every Friday when the house went meatless, because the body still needed something filling and warm. The sauce turned the simple egg patties into something that tasted far more complex than their ingredients suggested. When younger generations stopped keeping meatless Fridays, the dish quietly left the weekly rotation and took its place among the things only grandmothers remembered how to make. Number 14. Memelas. In Oaxaca and Puebla and in the Mexican-American families that carried those traditions north, memelas were the foundation of a proper morning meal. They looked like thick, oval tortillas, but the process was different, and the result was something else entirely. Fresh masa was shaped by hand into an oval about the size of an open palm, thicker than a tortilla, with a slight ridge pinched up around the edge to hold the toppings. The oval went onto a dry, hot comal and cooked on the first side until a light crust formed. Then it was flipped, and while the second side cooked, a thin layer of asiento, the dark, flavorful pork lard that settled at the bottom of the rendering pot, was spread across the cooked surface with the back of a spoon. That asiento was the ingredient that made memelas different from anything else. It had a deeper, almost nutty flavor compared to regular lard, and it soaked into the warm masa and gave it a richness that butter or oil could never match. On top of the asiento went a spoonful of black bean paste, a crumble of queso fresco, and a drizzle of red or green salsa. Eaten by hand, still warm from the comal, a memela was substantial enough to serve as an entire breakfast. The combination of the thick, slightly charred corn base, the savory depth of the asiento, and the sharp bite of the salsa made every bite different depending on where you tore it. The edges, where the pinched ridge held a pocket of salsa, were the best part. When families moved to cities in the United States, asiento became nearly impossible to find. Without it, a memela was just a thick tortilla with beans on top. The families that still make the real version guard their source of asiento the way others guard a family recipe, because without it, the dish is not the same. Number 13. Huevos con ejotes. Green beans were not a side dish in a Mexican-American kitchen. They were a main event. a handful of ejotes from the garden, snapped into short pieces, sautéed in a skillet with a little oil, onion, and chopped tomato until they softened. Then beaten eggs poured over the top and scrambled through. Salt, maybe a squeeze of lime. That was breakfast. It was a way to stretch 2 or 3 eggs into a full meal for a family by adding whatever the garden had that morning. Not glamorous, not complicated. Just a way to make sure nothing from the garden went to waste and nobody left the table hungry. Whatever was ripe that morning ended up in the skillet beside the eggs. Number 12. Gorditas de horno. Not every gordita came off a comal. In parts of Coahuila and Nuevo León, and in the border towns that straddled both sides, gorditas were baked in a wood-fired adobe oven until the outside turned golden and cracked slightly, while the inside stayed dense and soft. The masa was mixed with piloncillo and anise, giving the whole thing a faintly sweet, aromatic flavor that filled the kitchen while they baked. They came out heavy, warm, and satisfying enough that 2 or 3 with a cup of café de olla made a complete morning meal. The sweetness was gentle, not sugary, just enough to round out the corn flavor. When wood-fired ovens disappeared from backyards and kitchens shrank, these gorditas went with them. The stovetop version survived. The baked one, with that particular crust that only a clay oven could produce, did not. Number 11. Calabacitas con huevo. Tender Mexican squash diced into small cubes, sautéed in a skillet with a little oil until the edges turned golden and the flesh went soft. Your grandmother added diced onion, chopped tomato, and a strip of roasted green chile, then poured beaten eggs over the whole thing and stirred it together into a rough, colorful scramble. The squash gave the eggs a mild sweetness and a softness that potatoes never had. It was lighter but just as filling, and it used whatever small calabacitas were growing wild in the yard that morning. Families with backyard gardens ate this all summer long, because the squash grew faster than anyone could keep up with, and it had to go somewhere. When front yards turned into driveways and backyard gardens shrank to potted herbs on apartment windowsills, the supply of fresh calabacitas that made this breakfast effortless dried up with the soil. Number 10. Discada norteña. The name came from the cooking surface, a large steel plow disc, the kind pulled behind a tractor to break soil, was flipped upside down, set over an open fire, and turned into a massive concave skillet. On it went a mix of chopped meats, bacon, chorizo, beef, pork, and sometimes hot dogs, all cut into small pieces and fried together in the fat that rendered out as they cooked. Onions, tomatoes, and jalapenos went in next. The whole thing sizzled and popped over the open flame, the smoke mixing with the smell of charred meat and chile. Served in flour tortillas with a squeeze of lime, discada was the breakfast of ranches, hunting camps, and Sunday morning gatherings in northern Mexico, and across the border in Texas and New Mexico. The disc was seasoned by years of use and never washed with soap. Without the disc and the open fire, the dish does not taste the same. The breakfasts that follow are the ones that pulled entire families out of bed and sometimes brought the whole neighborhood to one kitchen. Number 9. Pan de pulque. The dough rose without commercial yeast. Pan de pulque used fermented agave sap as its leavening agent, giving the bread a faint sour tang and a dense, moist crumb that stayed soft for days. Bakers in central Mexico and in the older Mexican-American communities of Texas kneaded it by hand and let it rise slowly in the heat of the bakery. The loaves came out golden, faintly sweet, with a chew that no other Mexican bread had. Families sliced it thick and ate it with butter and coffee, or dipped it into hot chocolate. The problem was the pulque. Fresh pulque spoils within hours and cannot be bottled or shipped, so bakers who relied on it had to be close to a source. When pulque fell out of fashion and bakeries switched to commercial yeast, pan de pulque quietly vanished from the shelves. Number 8. Capirotada. It started with stale bread. Bolillos, or telleras left over from the day before, sliced thick and toasted on a comal, until the edges turned dark and the centers dried out completely. In a separate pot, piloncillo dissolved slowly in water with a stick of cinnamon and a few whole cloves until it became a thick, dark syrup that smelled like burnt caramel. The bread went into a deep clay cazuela in layers. First a layer of toasted bread, then a drizzle of piloncillo syrup, a handful of peanuts, a scattering of raisins, and slices of aged cheese, the salty kind that fought against the sweetness. Then another layer of bread, more syrup, more cheese, until the cazuela was full. It baked slowly until the bread soaked up the syrup and the cheese melted into golden threads between the layers. In Mexican-American homes across Texas, New Mexico, and California, capirotada was the Lenten breakfast that turned fasting into something nobody complained about. Families served it warm, spooned out of the cazuela in thick, sticky wedges that pulled apart in strings of melted cheese. Children ate it with their hands and came back for a second piece before the adults had finished their first. Every family adjusted it. Some added sliced bananas. Others used pecans instead of peanuts or stirred in a spoonful of butter. The only constants were the piloncillo, the stale bread, and the cheese. Without all three, it was not capirotada. When bakeries stopped selling bolillos and telleras by the dozen and families started buying sliced sandwich bread in plastic bags, the foundation of the dish changed. The soft factory bread dissolved instead of holding its shape, and the whole thing turned to mush instead of the layered, chewy structure that made capirotada worth the effort of building it one layer at a time. Number 7. Champurrado. Thicker than atole and darker than hot chocolate, champurrado was something in between. Your grandmother ground a disc of Mexican chocolate with a little warm water, then stirred it into a pot of masa dissolved in milk. Piloncillo went in for sweetness, cinnamon for warmth, and the whole thing simmered low while she worked it with a molinillo. The carved wooden whisk she rolled between her palms until the surface foamed. The result was dense enough to feel like a meal, and sweet enough to satisfy without being dessert. Champurrado was the drink that went beside the tamales at Christmas, beside the buñuelos during the holidays, and beside the pan dulce on any cold morning when the house needed warming from the inside out. Children wrapped both hands around the mug because the clay held the heat longer than anything else in the kitchen. When instant cocoa packets and coffee machines took over the morning routine, champurrado became something families made once a year instead of once a week. Number 6. Huevos ahogados. Drowned eggs. A pot of simmering salsa roja made from dried guajillo chilies, tomato, and garlic, thin enough to pool, but thick enough to hold its flavor. Whole eggs cracked directly into the sauce, one at a time, the whites spreading and cooking in the warm liquid while the yolks stayed soft underneath. The pot went to the table with a stack of tortillas, and everyone scooped out their own egg, dragging it through the red sauce and onto the tortilla. The yolk broke and mixed with the chile sauce into something rich and silky. It was a communal breakfast, everyone reaching into the same pot, tearing tortillas, talking over each other. No plates necessary. In Jalisco and Michoacán, and in the communities that settled in California and the Midwest, huevos ahogados were the Sunday morning meal that brought the whole family to the kitchen at once. When families got smaller and mornings got separate, the shared pot lost its purpose. Number 5. Chorizo con huevo. Homemade chorizo was a production. Ground pork mixed with dried chilies, guajillo, and ancho usually, that had been toasted, soaked, and blended into a thick paste. Vinegar, garlic, cumin, oregano, black pepper, and a pinch of cloves went in. It was mixed by hand, packed into a bowl, and left to cure in the refrigerator for a day or two. Families that raised their own pigs made chorizo in batches, enough to last weeks. Scrambled with eggs, that chorizo turned the skillet into a slick of red-orange oil that stained the spatula, the plate, and the tortilla you wrapped it in. The flavor was smoky, spicy, and deep. Nothing like the bright red paste that comes in a plastic tube from the grocery store today. The smell of it cooking took over the whole house and drifted out the kitchen window. Neighbors knew what you were having without asking. Today, most families buy their chorizo pre-made. The homemade batches that followed a family recipe passed through generations are getting harder to find. Not because the recipe is gone, but because the time and tradition of making it have moved on. Number 4. Tamales de rajas con queso. Not every tamal had meat inside. On mornings when the budget was tight, or the season called for it, your grandmother spread fresh masa on a soaked corn husk, laid a strip of roasted poblano chile down the center, added a finger of queso fresco, folded the husk, and steamed it. The chile softened inside the masa, and the cheese melted into a thread that stretched when you pulled the tamal open. These were lighter than pork or chicken tamales, and they came together faster because there was no meat to braise first. Families made them in large batches and reheated them on a comal for breakfast all week. The combination of roasted pepper and corn masa was clean and simple, the kind of breakfast that did not try to be anything more than what it was. Number 3. Buñuelos de viento. Thin discs of wheat flour dough rolled out by hand until you could almost see through them, dropped into a pot of hot oil where they puffed and turned golden in seconds. Your grandmother lifted them out with a slotted spoon, laid them on brown paper to drain, and dusted them with cinnamon sugar while they were still crackling. They shattered when you bit into them, flaking apart into crisp, sweet layers that dissolved on the tongue. In Guadalajara and Aguascalientes, and across the Mexican-American Southwest, buñuelos de viento were the holiday breakfast that children woke up hoping for. Some families drizzled them with piloncillo syrup instead of sugar. Others served them plain beside a cup of hot chocolate. Making them was fast, and eating them was faster. A plate of buñuelos could vanish from the table before the coffee was ready, and the ones set aside for later never survived the morning. Number 2. Gorditas. Thick corn pancakes made from fresh masa mixed with a little milk, sugar, and cinnamon, spooned onto a hot comal, and cooked until the edges firmed up and the centers stayed soft and slightly creamy. They were not tortillas, and they were not American pancakes. They sat somewhere in between, with the earthy corn flavor of masa and a faint sweetness that did not need syrup. In Michoacán and Guanajuato, and in the Mexican-American families who traced their roots to those states, gorditas were the weekend breakfast that children asked for by name. Eaten plain, or with a drizzle of condensed milk, or with a smear of fresh cream and a pinch of salt. The name comes from correr, to drip or pour, describing how the batter spread across the hot surface. Making them required fresh masa, not the dried flour from a bag. And that was the problem. When fresh masa stopped being something families made or bought daily, gorditas became one of those dishes that lived only in the memory of the people who tasted them as children. Number 1. Huevos a la mexicana. The colors of the flag on a plate, diced white onion, chopped fresh tomato, and sliced serrano chile. Sautéed together in a hot skillet with a little oil until the onion went translucent and the tomato started to break down. Then beaten eggs poured in and scrambled through the vegetables until everything was just set, still soft, not dry. That was the whole dish. 3 ingredients, 3 colors, and a pair of hands that knew when to stop stirring. The simplicity was the point. There was nothing to hide behind. Overcooked eggs, underripe tomatoes, or too much chili, and the balance fell apart. Grandmothers who made it every morning had the timing memorized. The skillet was ready before the coffee finished brewing, and the eggs hit the plate while the tortillas were still warm. Huevos a la mexicana is still on menus across the country. But the version that mattered, the one made by a specific person in a specific kitchen with a rhythm built over decades of repetition, is tied to a generation that is getting smaller every year. The recipe will survive. The hands will not. Those are 25 breakfasts that stretched a handful of ingredients into something worth waking up for. If your grandmother's recipe is still alive in your kitchen, that is something worth protecting. Tell us in the comments which breakfast brings back the strongest memory. If this meant something to you, share it with someone who remembers, and hit subscribe so you never miss another one. This has been The Hungry Mexican.